Hello, everyone. This is Shannan Vance-Ocampo. I use she and her pronouns, and I serve as the General Presbyter for the Presbytery of Southern New England. And this is Connecting Our Conversations, our podcast space for conversations that push the edges of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church, USA. During the months of January and February of 2025, we are doing a special podcast series on being a Matthew 25 presbytery. You are hearing this podcast while I am away on sabbatical. I wanted to leave something behind that would be a ministry resource for the whole presbytery. And as a Matthew 25 presbytery, this work is at the heart of our ministry. In addition to this podcast, our presbytery meetings and other events in 2025 will focus around various Matthew 25 themes and resources as well. This podcast series during January and February of 2025 will explore the areas of Matthew 25 ministry, including conversations on the history and theological why behind being a Matthew 25 church, what intersectionality is, and why that practice is at the heart of this sort of ministry. For today's episode, we will be talking about the Matthew 25 focus on dismantling structural racism and what that means for us as a people of faith. We today are joined by the Reverend Jermaine Ross-Allam, almost the Reverend Dr. Jermaine Ross-Allam. He'll be defending his thesis this spring at Union Theological Seminary, one of our neighbors. And Jermaine directs the Center for the Repair of Historical Harms, which is a new office in the national offices of the Presbyterian Church USA. And it's been my pleasure to get to know Jermaine over the last 2 years as he's begun his work in ministry among us. So welcome, Jermaine. We're so glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Shannon. It's a blessing to be here with you today and to address the presbytery and your other listeners.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. So I love to start out with introductions. People know me, so give you a chance to introduce yourself, who you are, how you got here, whatever makes sense for you in introductions.
Sure. So my name is Jermaine Ross-Allam, and I originally come from a very small town in rural Southeast Texas called Willis. It's one of the few one-exit towns, although I think it's got 2 exits now. But I was raised there by my mom and my dad, right during the time period that we can now refer to as the transition from the old Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow. I went to college at United, well, not United, sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of my own story, but I went to college at Southwestern Adventist University, which is a reflection of my Seventh-day Adventist upbringing, where I studied music and journalism was my major, actually. But long story short, I went through many, many permutations of what a career is for me that would make sense. And that took me to seminary, as it does for a lot of people. And I started my seminary journey at Houston Graduate School of Theology in Houston before transferring to United Theological Seminary, where I graduated in 2012 with my MDiv. And there in the Twin Cities, my first ministry assignment was at Kwanzaa Community Church, now known as Liberty Community Church, PCUSA. And I started there as the executive director of 21st Century Academy, which was co-founded with Reverend Dr. Lika Galloway and myself as a racial justice initiative that focused particularly on interrupting the school to prison pipeline that claimed so many lives of our African-American boys and girls. And during that same time period, I also took an additional position at Oak Grove Presbyterian Church, where I was pastor for social justice there while still at Kwanzaa, now Liberty Community Church. And that was a context that helped me, between those 2 locations at the same time. It really helped me refine what my ministry would be from there moving forward. And that was also the time period that was defined by the court's decision around Trayvon Martin, and then a little bit later, the killing of Philando Castile. And of course, after I moved on from that ministry to New York, of course, everybody has heard the name George Floyd by now. So my early ministry context really helped me sharpen my answer to the question, what part of how we repair these historic harms are you called to play? And it was not hard to understand that I was being called to play some role, but
Mm,
it took some doing, some praying, some studying, some consultation, and a lot of other processes to really come to an understanding that God perhaps is calling me to do something that many Christians believe for a long time is impossible. And the impossibility, of course, that we are now working to make an actuality is Christian support for national calls for reparations for African Americans, as well as for reparative processes for indigenous peoples, and even beyond as we look at the
mm,
international scene. And it was academic work, it was the prayers and the support of the people at both Kwanzaa and Oak Grove Presbyterian Church, and earnest questions and wrestling in both of those contexts, plus really good academic training at United Seminary and later on Union Theological Seminary that really helped me sharpen my focus and really gain confidence to move forward and listen to what God is calling me to do,
mm.
despite the number of people who thought that was a bad idea and that there would not be a critical mass of people willing to move in that direction
Right,
along with some of us who've been moving in that direction for a while.
right. And you're finishing up your PhD at Union in New York City. And I don't know if you want to
Yes,
say a little bit about that. I always think it's so interesting, some of that work. And I
the
keep
work
telling you when you and I see each other, I keep saying, I'll be there for your defense. I'll drive over to the city and be around that day.
yes,
So
yes,
getting close.
I appreciate the vote of confidence, and especially, the aspirational fall graduation date is probably going to be pushed out a little bit longer,
Hmm.
just because of the intensity of that work and
Sure.
my current calling with our
Hmm.
national offices means that I'm going to need more time than I wished that I needed, but gratefully that will be a possibility. But the work itself is focusing on what I'm referring to as a social ecology of extralegal violence against African Americans. And I'm looking at the New York draft riots in 1862 all the way to 1898's Wilmington massacre, which was a racist terrorist activity that actually also is the first successful coup d'etat to take place in the United States,
Mm,
overthrowing democratically elected government in order to install by force a white supremacist government that was intent on reversing the trend of multi-ethnic coalitions winning official office and moving in a direction the white supremacists did not want to go. So
mm,
my dissertation takes a look not only at the individuals who cause certain atrocities with a focus on lynching, but I'm interested in how does the atmosphere form? How do you form an atmosphere in which
mm,
people can predict in advance that they can commit atrocities on the basis of race and not experience federal or local interference from the authority?
mhm,
How is that environment formed in political economy, in science, in theology, in journalism, and in public opinion more generally? Understanding that the formation of that environment, I think, will help us understand the persistence of racial terrorism in the United States and why so many of us are certain on a gut level that justice will never take place.
mm,
I'm focused on the assurance that we have in the reality of who God is and in the power that we have in the Holy Spirit, that those inevitabilities are actually not inevitabilities, but those are just unspiritual habits of mind that have structured and have deformed our imaginations so that we believe things are not possible, that God is actually making more and more possible every day. So on
mm,
the academic side, I'm looking at the formation of this understanding that things can never fundamentally change. And I want to know, how did that atmosphere form? But in the work that I do as director of the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms, I get an opportunity that I'm really happy to have to practice the knowledge that reparations are right, necessary, and possible. And it's the power of the Holy Spirit that transforms old impossibilities into new possibilities and future realities.
mm, mm. Thank you.
You're
Let's
welcome.
talk a little bit about this Center for the Repair of Historical Harms, because of course, well, you direct it, so you know lots about it, and I served on the board of the mission agency when we were developing it and developing the proposal to start such a center. But I think it's still a new enough thing in the PCUSA where sort of the average Presbyterian is still learning about it and learning what's going on with it. So if you want to give us a 101 about the center and its work, its direction and ministry, and maybe outline a couple of the projects you've either worked on so far or have in the pipeline as a way of explaining what some of this work is going to look like when actualized in the life of the church. That would be great.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I like to tell people every time that I have an opportunity to describe the work of the center is that the center is focused on growing the number of human beings working to share the good news that repair and reparations make common sense for the common good as soon as possible and for as long as it takes. And the reason why I like to present our work in that way is because we want to dispel the mistaken notion that reparations are about digging up something impossible that just makes people feel guilty, or that reparations is something that is so divisive and so expensive that it's better to simply ignore it as a possibility in order to preserve harmony between us as a nation and between members of congregations and of the denomination. But instead, we understand that repair and reparations actually make common sense for the common good because it allows us to end this hostility between us based on the invention of racial ideology, which is also paired with the invention that we can't somehow move beyond racial ideology while also repairing many of its damages that continue as contemporary legacies. And so in order to help people understand that this is a creative move in response to the grace of God that is poured out on us from the Holy Spirit, we also like to emphasize that we are following the Spirit's lead on the path toward our great reencounter. And when I say great reencounter, I'm simply naming the fact that Presbyterians initially encountered multiple groups of historic communities in such a way that damage was produced that was not necessary. And the popular form of thought in our country, unfortunately, is that while we should tell the truth about the past, we shouldn't try to do anything about the past that would jeopardize our
Mhm.
image of what the future entails.
Mm.
But we realize that that's actually a superstitious way of thinking about the future because you can't move forward into a future without understanding what went wrong in some of these initial encounters. And again, we believe that once we observe what these initial encounters are and begin to respond in earnest to what historic communities are calling for by way of repair, then we can imagine what a future looks like once we have regained the opportunity to trust one another. And then
Mm.
we can start looking at the spiritual and the theological opportunities that are now in front of us to go
Mm.
look at the past and realize we really messed up by disregarding certain indigenous traditions in Africa and the Caribbean
Mhm.
and the United States. And now we have the opportunity to reinvestigate those initial encounters and this
Mhm.
time encounter one another on the basis of mutual curiosity, creativity, and mutual respect so that we can
Mhm.
enrich our collective theological lives and begin to become a witness that
Mhm.
the other people we share this planet with will notice and say, oh, all is not lost. There is an
Mhm.
opportunity to regain lost time by revisiting and correcting these initial encounters.
Mhm.
And so that's the spirit with which we move forward. The specific initiatives and the projects that we're involved in right now include responding to the General Assembly's resolution um, affectionately referred to as RGJ07, which is a resolution addressing the lack of installed pastoral leadership in
Right.
people of color congregations. That is an enormous task that the General Assembly gave us that involves
Yes.
two distinct things. On one hand, it's a lot of research and data collecting about what churches have installed pastoral leadership, which churches don't. We're looking
Mm-hmm.
at what is the ethnic makeup of the churches that can afford to call installed pastors, and what's the ethnic makeup of churches that can't. And
Mm-hmm.
among those churches that don't have the resources to call and install a pastor full time, we're tasked with understanding, is that because of the need to responsibly retire debt? Is that related to problems with meeting the presbytery minimum, et cetera, et cetera? So we're in the
Mm-hmm.
process now, working in collaboration with research services to get the data that we need so that then we can implement a program that allows churches to announce to the world what their ministry dreams are and what they would do to move those ministry plans forward once they have equitable access to resources. And so,
Mm-hmm.
again, collaborating across agencies to gather the resources necessary to respond in the affirmative to the plans that churches have to take their ministries to the next level once they have
Mm-hmm.
the resources that they need to call full-time pastoral leadership. And we're really excited about that. We love the data collecting process because it gives us the information that we need. But what we're really enthusiastic is being able to work closely with mid-councils and congregations to see how this process of equipping and resourcing our churches can become a cause for celebration across the
Mm-hmm.
denomination. In addition to that, we are also working to respond to a call for repair that has come to us from the Liberia Council of Churches. Last year, the Center for Repair was asked to join the co-moderator's trip to Liberia. And that was during a time period where the Center for Repair had an opportunity to talk with the Liberia Council of Churches and put a somewhat heavy question on the table. And this was a question that I learned by reading some preparatory material written by a sociologist and an anthropologist. And they asked this question that continues to haunt me to this day. They ask, what if African Americans recently emancipated from slavery in the United States arrived in Liberia in the early 19th century, not as colonialists and missionaries, but as eager partners in a nation building process
Mm-hmm.
among equals? And when I put that question out on the table, I was hoping that people would find it to be an interesting question. But I was really blessed to see that people took that question directly to heart. And the response is that we need to revisit that question as an action that begins today, that characterizes our future generation as Christian peoples together from here into the future. And so because of that, we have just signed a memorandum of understanding and partnership,
Yeah.
our Office of Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations, led by Diana Wright. And
Right.
we will now begin a process of not only reestablishing the relationship between the PCUSA and Presbyterians in Liberia, but we will work with the youth desk at the Liberia Council of Churches, and we will convene a panel of experts of their choosing who will help us investigate what role did Presbyterian support for the founding of the American Colonization Society play ultimately in the outbreak of civil war in Liberia at the end of the 20th century.
Wow.
That will be a long process of investigation, but we sincerely believe that once we understand the historical impact of beginning in the particularly colonial way that we did, then we will know the things that we need to know to apologize appropriately and engage in the reparatory processes that are called for. So then we can reset the relationship on both sides of the Atlantic, again, as a witness to the world that all is never lost when we decide to follow the leading of the Holy Spirit and be transformed and start a new pattern that recharacterizes what people thought once upon a time was nothing more than crying over spilled milk.
Yeah.
So
You know,
those are,
I read this. Oh, go ahead, Jermaine. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
yeah. And just one last thing I think
Yeah,
I
one
want to
last thing.
point
Yeah.
out is that, we continue to follow up this year and next year on the work that began as we responded to the General Assembly's referral to the Center for Repair to offer reparations and an official apology for the racist manner in which Memorial Presbyterian Church was closed in Juneau, Alaska in 1963.
Mhm.
I think people probably have heard about the work that took place last year as we formed an interagency delegation that visited twice and eventually offered our official apology and offered our reparations that were approved by the General Assembly. But behind the scenes during that time period, Indigenous officials in that region were very curious whether or not we understood that
Mm,
took place in Juneau in 1963 was just the tip of the iceberg. I was told by leadership, by Clan and Indigenous broader tribal leadership, that what really needs to take place is that we should visit Sitka, because Sitka, Alaska, in their words, is ground zero for Presbyterian activities, colonial activities in Alaska.
mm,
And so this year, I fulfilled the promise that I made last year by visiting Sitka, Alaska twice in order to
wow.
understand what went on in that region and what are Indigenous leaders calling on the Presbyterian Church to do by way of repairs. And what we discovered in that process is that the repair priorities coming from Indigenous leadership there involves assistance in repatriating human remains,
Mm,
also some assistance, and the assistance required is not quite clarified yet, but we're working on clarity as we speak, but helping to revive or to somehow respond to the intentional destruction of Clan House as an Indigenous spiritual and social tradition. The Clan House was a context where some things went on that I believe nobody misses. But in addition to those things that perhaps no one misses, the Clan House was a cultural context for many things, including the appropriate processing of grief and other ways of healing colonial
mm,
harms and other just things that happen in life. And without that context, I'm learning, people were at a loss for appropriate ways to process loss and grief
mm,
in that context, in addition to having celebrations that are part of what make life worth living and that
mm,
create and preserve synergy and connectivities between people. So there are movements right now underway to rebuild those clan houses, and the PCUSA is being called upon to be a part of rebuilding that context as a
mm,
matter of healing. And certainly, as something we already knew about from our work last year, language preservation continues to be a very, very important point
mhm,
of, painful memory about
mm,
Presbyterian missionary work, since Presbyterians were very intentional to
mm,
target language extinction as a main objective of Presbyterian missionary activity, in addition to some other activities that people found useful and life-giving. Destruction of language was one method that was required to comply with certain agreements with the federal government. And then finally, repatriating sacred objects continues to be very important to the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples of Alaska. And some of those items were transferred illegally, if you will, which
mm,
means in violation of Klan protocols, out of Indigenous custody and into the custody of Sheldon Jackson Boarding School, which is now Sheldon Jackson Fine Arts Museum. But some of those objects are also in other museums that are affiliated with the Presbyterian people. So recently, we've been working in collaboration, for example, with the Presbyterian Historical Society in order to discover whether or not certain protocols were enacted in order to take possession of some of these items. And we were able to work with the Historical Society just this past week and
mm,
draw the conclusion that no protocols were followed. And therefore, they were able to use that information as part of a legal procedure that they are
mm.
now engaged in, trying to get their sacred objects back. And so those
Wow.
just represent, just kind of a vignette of some of the work that we're currently involved in.
Mhm. Yeah, and as I listen to you, I think to myself, I hope those who are listening to us, um, can listen to this and imagine the gift that it is to be part of a denomination that is um, considering things like all of that, what you had just described, which with such thoughtfulness and with intention, that these are not one and dones, check it off the list sort of things, but that these are partnerships, relationships, rebuilding, and that, repair is a long-term prospect. And I do think that that issue that you raised early on about, um, the force that shame occupies in all of our lives and in the life of our church is significant in our culture. And we think if we don't talk about something or we don't go back and look at what happened, even if it's a look back of 150, 200 years, whatever it is, people, we've moved on since then. It's not worth it. We don't need to go back there. Nothing good is going to come of that. But that these communities have all persisted, over this period of time. We've persisted as a community of Presbyterians, the Tlingit people, right, in Alaska, they've persisted, the folks in Liberia, etc. And so, we're still all here. We still need to figure this out. And we're all still carrying woundedness with us. And we know from, certainly the studies that have been done on folks like generations after the Holocaust, that this stuff is in your DNA. It's not some sort of like sort of hooey idea or some sort of like strange spiritual idea. Like it's scientifically provable that the trauma, the lack of connection, the things that get broken carry on generation by generation, even if we don't talk about it. It
Right.
sits, on our DNA structure. And so as I was listening to you talk about the clan houses and how the breaking of that tradition or the breaking of language traditions, there's DNA damage from those things that is happening. And so how do we repair? And I read this really interesting book recently that talked about this idea of what they call it, the colonial wound, and how um, the colonial wound is multi-directional. And the person that or the community that engaged in the wounding is harmed, the community that was wounded is harmed, and then there's this ecological wounding that goes on too, because colonialism is about extraction and is about land theft, and it's beyond the human experience, right? And so so as I listen to this and think also about this, the theological piece of Matthew 25, where Jesus is talking about healing, that there's woundedness, but that we also have access to healing when we think about our faith and what the work of Jesus, what the work of resurrection does in our lives. So I think it's building that theological whole for all of us. And we all, if we dig back enough in our own personal histories, have that in us, right?
Oh,
I'm
yes.
I'm, beginning to get more and more information out of my family about our family history. And I think we all need to be kind of excavating those pieces. And it's hard. It's hard to get people to talk to me about it, right?
Right.
But every once in a while I have an opportunity and I, start to pull some threads and it's but there is a reticence to go back and look at those pieces in a clear-eyed kind of way. So I just want to say it's it's interesting to be part of a larger piece with that work, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how does that for you fit into Matthew 25 as I talk about it a little bit and sort of that larger theological structure we're trying to live in the church today?
So there's an interesting part of Matthew 25 that I don't hear people talk about very often,
Mm.
but I have a really perhaps bizarre relationship to the sheep and the goats.
Uh-huh.
When I was a kid, I had a recurring nightmare, I guess. It's kind of a cartoon now, but as a kid, it was a recurring nightmare that suddenly the second coming was imminent. I'm
Mm.
like within like a few minutes. It's about to happen, but the angels were in the process of gathering the sheep on one side and the goats on the other side. And there I was, a little small kid in the back of the section for the goats. And for whatever reason, I thought, well, obviously that's my section because that's the kind of person I feel like I am inside. So I'm one of
Hmm.
the goats. But I had this idea, even as a kid, which is bizarre, that, ooh, what if I took this time between now and when Jesus actually gets here to find a way to sneak from the goat section and hunker down really low and go over to the sheep side?
Yeah.
And I don't know why that occurred to me, but this was a dream that came up again and again and again
Mm.
and again during my childhood until, one blessed day it stopped.
Yeah.
But I've been thinking about that throughout this entire time that I've been
Yeah.
exposed to the Matthew 25 ministry, which I
Mm,
think historically is probably one of the most faithful and bold moves for Christians to make on this planet in our entire
mhm,
history as Christian people. But one question that I always have in mind is what's happening among those of us who think that we're on the right side, those of us who are the
mm,
sheep. What are we doing to keep our head on a swivel, to keep an eye out for those people who are trying to figure out a way to make the same transition that I
mm,
dreamed about as a child? Because as an African American, I realized that there's a shortage of people in the United States who think reparative justice is right, necessary, and possible.
mm,
So I'm always preoccupied with how do we grow the number of people so that the next Barack Hussein Obama won't be able to say, I believe in reparations in the abstract, but I see it as a political impracticality, so I won't worry about it in my presidency.
right.
I'm interested to figure out, okay, if that's a fact about the electorate, and if that's a fact about the people in our congregations, how then can we pay attention to every opportunity that we have to increase the number of people who do see
Hmm.
reparations as the right thing, both in the abstract, but also as a matter of practicality? So when I
Hmm.
think about the Matthew 25 movement, I do think about this stark, first century
Hmm.
Judea and of the sheep and the goats. And I don't presume, of course, that I'm somehow, on God's winning team of people and other people are somehow just not getting it.
Right.
But I
Right.
do understand that there are people who have possibilities implanted by the Holy Spirit in their hearts, but they're
Hmm.
looking for opportunities to make that real work that they do together with other human beings. And so I like to think of that kind of jokingly as the goat to sheep transition. And that part of our jobs, I think, is to help people respond appropriately to what the Holy Spirit is doing out of gratitude for what the Holy Spirit is doing to transform all of us all of the time. And so
Hmm.
I do think helping people understand this is the right way to go. This is
Hmm.
safe, and it's not always safe. And I don't mean to say that there's
Yeah.
no pushback when the empire decides to strike back. But I
Hmm.
think people want some reassurance that the Holy Spirit is moving us in this direction. And on the level of technicalities, that these are real and feasible pathways to follow. The answer to that, of course, is yes. These are real and feasible pathways that
Hmm.
we can follow. But I'm really preoccupied with sharing that good news with people and being able to engage them in such a way that the light can go off in their minds and that they can say, ah, I see it now.
Hmm.
I'm going to follow in this direction and I'm going to bring some friends along with me.
Yeah, and it's getting our theological focus back into um how we build beloved community, right? Because so much of how our world and especially US American society is set up is very adversarial, very binary, black and white. And so we just don't imagine that there's other possibilities out there on all sorts of fronts. And um, usually God's not found in those in the binaries, right? But sort of in the middle or somewhere else. And the first presbytery I served back in 2014, Albany Presbytery, but right, the first presbytery meeting I went to, there was a report that was being made of some work that had happened before I got there. It was a church that had had a person, the treasurer, had embezzled money at the church.
Hmm.
And they had found out about this, and um, administrative commission or investigation had been formed, under our rules of discipline, in the Book of Order and all of this. And it was a crime, right? Money had been stolen and misappropriated, and real harm had happened to the ministry of this congregation and all of this. And the team that worked on it with the church had a contact with somebody in the community that was doing restorative justice work. And
Hmm.
so they spent a much longer time working on it than they would have if they had just gone down the sort of straight path, which was the police charges, probably an arrest, maybe a trial of some kind, and then a church process and taking away this person's ordination as an elder and all this kind of stuff. They didn't go down that path, But instead, they went down and had invited this restorative justice group to come in and work with them and coach them through a process
Wow.
of doing that instead. And there were still, reparations made and a plan for return of probably not all of the funds. I don't remember all the details. But I remember they wanted to take time at the presbytery meeting, and I just was a visitor at that point. It was my first meeting. I'd been there like think I'd been on the job for like 2 weeks, so I didn't know what was going on, right? And so I'm just listening, but I was so impressed. I remember being so impressed by this. This was 11 years ago because they wanted to take time at a presbytery meeting, and they took a long time, like over an hour of meeting time. And Presbyterians are really serious about our tight little dockets at these meetings, right?
Oh,
But
yes.
they had worked it out. They'd gotten time on the docket, and they wanted to walk the presbytery step by step through what they had done to repair the harm and how they had found multi-directional places this harm had happened and ways to heal them, and then the theology of what they were doing and who this community organization was that they, brought alongside to help. And what they wanted really to do was not shame this person in public. This wasn't sort of a public shaming situation, but instead to offer the presbytery a different vision that was much more theologically aligned of what we could do in a situation like this.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was a very, sort of minute niche, boundaried situation, very different than the sort of big picture things you're working on, of course. But that idea of providing a different witness and that idea of providing a different way forward and a different idea of how you can do something as a church that is telling a story and proclaiming a truth about God and inviting everyone who's hearing it into deeper discipleship, right?
Absolutely. No, and I mean, the work that churches do, like what you've just described, is so fundamental
Mm-hmm.
because it's implementation on the micro level.
Right.
That's where we hit snags. And
Mm-hmm.
there are moments of transformation on sessions within congregations that take place when individuals decide, you know what, I want to figure out how to make this procedure viable.
Mm-hmm.
Always want to encourage people to not look at the small scale as if it's somehow inferior to the
Mm-hmm.
broader goals, because
Right.
I think it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Once individuals determine to do the right thing and to figure out how to make it viable according to our bureaucratic procedures, book of order, and other fiduciary responsibilities that come with various positions, that's actually really important work, without which you
Mm-hmm.
can't persuade a large number of people that you can scale up these type
Mm-hmm.
of procedures to the regional and to the national and
Mm-hmm.
even international level. So I really love to pay attention to what I call conversion processes that take
Mm-hmm.
place on the local level, because there are people we would assume, oh, clerk of session, that doesn't sound like a very radical or woke person. We'll have to figure out how to work around that person, or the
Mm-hmm.
accounting department or the legal department. Many of
Mm-hmm.
us got an academic background in social justice related topics in the liberal arts, or whether, our experiences on the ground, organizing people. Sometimes experience can tempt us into discounting certain people as, at best, potential obstacles to be overcome, when in
Right.
fact, those people may become the greatest allies and
Mm-hmm.
assets to reparative justice movements once we send signals that communicate we're not going to make assumptions about
Right.
your readiness to help out in this work simply because you don't fit a certain profile that we
Mm-hmm.
associate with a social justice warrior or something of that sort.
Yeah. Yeah. And we all are presented with opportunities to do repair. We just don't always notice them as the opportunities to do repair, and how that is such a deep um, spiritual opportunity um, to do the work that Jesus was always inviting us into. His whole ministry was about repair. His whole ministry was about offering third ways to do things, and ways
Right.
that were not the way of empire or the way of a binary or the way of we always did it that way. And so, how can we keep becoming deeper and deeper disciples of Jesus is really the question behind all of this. And how can we be about the primary ministry of Jesus, which was a ministry of healing in the face of, incredible pain.
Yes.
And also a story that was told then that's the same story we're told now that you were just talking about, which is there's nothing you can do about it. The story that people Jesus was with, they were encountering was there's nothing you can do about the Roman Empire. They're just
Right.
so big, they're so powerful, like you're not going to get around that. And they're just going to run you over. Just kind of get in line and find a way to fit in. And Jesus was offering something different. And I think we feel that way so often in our society today. I hear lots of people talking about that as, in a run up to an election as we're recording this fall, like, well, my vote doesn't count, or I don't have a piece in this. And but Jesus is always saying you have a way, you have a role, you have a context. And I still hold on to that story from 11 years ago. And I hope in my ministry I don't encounter
Because of a congregation's lack
another
of
time of um, embezzlement, right? But if I do, I have an idea in my mind now of what I might do with it, because someone gave their testimony of doing a third way, which might someday enable me or enable me to give an idea to a colleague or something else. So I think those are all key pieces. Our presbytery, Jermaine, you and I have talked a little bit about the context of this presbytery, Southern New England, right? We are in Connecticut, Rhode Island, a lot of Massachusetts, and of course, our context is so specific in this presbytery as it is everywhere else. This is where one of the first landings, or one of the landings that gets talked about the most, right? Plymouth Rock, and is here. We also have Rhode Island and the connections to the triangle trade during the time of enslavement, and all sorts of things going on that are just so deep in the history of the places that we occupy in ministry. And so I'm curious what some of your thoughts are when you think about a context like this, a location like this. And I definitely notice, and we were just talking about this in our anti-racism and equity team, that it's really hard to get people to talk about these things because it's hard for people to go back and talk about that, how colonized the land is that we all are on in this part of the United States, and what has happened on this land, and the repercussions that then had going out, going westward. It's a lot to talk about, and I find it's hard to get people to talk about that, to go back and talk about it. Wondering what your thoughts are, and just a little bit of our context, geographically, where we are.
I think the Presbytery of Southern New England is in a really important geographic area to remember some of the original conflicts at the heart of formation of the United States as a group of very diverse human beings trying to figure out what does unity require. And I think specifically about W.E.B. Du Bois in that context. And I think in particular about his dissertation, which was later published as, what is it, Suppression of the Slave Trade. And it's got a subtitle, the details of which I don't remember. But in that dissertation, he tries to represent the beginnings of the United States as a continental republic as being born in a conflict between freedom and on one hand, freedom and the slavery people thought was required to support the freedom of some. And he's relentless in his observations of the decisions that were made so that as a result of what he wrote, we could come to an understanding that we still have an opportunity to resolve this contradiction that began at the heart of the nation. And in particular, he looks at different leaders from, I think, Georgia and South Carolina, and what they're saying about slavery, and what some other people in other states were saying. No, for example, it's not worth even having a national union if we're united with slavery as part of the deal. But then folks from the southern part of the nation were in conversation, I believe, with folks from Massachusetts and Connecticut in
Oh,
particular.
interesting.
Yeah, so he details those conversations, and I wish I had it
Mm-hmm.
memorized, but he shows us how a compromise was struck, even within that context, between those people who benefited from the physical labor on plantations of enslaved people, vis-a-vis people in the northern region who benefited differently from the
Right.
practice of slavery in terms of commodities and shipping, et cetera.
The
And
sugar
so
trade. Yeah.
yeah, and so with that, yeah, sugar trade, rum, like
Mm-hmm.
shipbuilding, and I think other things, but there
Yeah.
was a symbiotic relationship between finance, so to speak, and the
Mm-hmm.
plantation communities and the power that came from enslaving people. And so what
Mm-hmm.
that reminds us is that in the United States, there is no sector of society that can claim innocence. At least there's not a geographic section in the United States that can claim
Right.
any form of innocence around the legacies of both enslavement on the basis of race and segregation and Jim Crow that followed.
Mm.
Because either you had the financing of enslavement in one section and the practice of enslavement in another section, or the refusal to allow people of African descent to occupy the Western frontier, so to speak, that was being opened up for fear that the presence of African descended people would attract greedy
Mm.
people who would then lower the wages of white men because of the presence of enslavable African Americans. And so every section of our nation historically has played some role in exacerbating the problems of race ideology that are on our agenda to solve now. And so again, the point is not to rope everybody into a collective sense of guilt, but it's instead to reintroduce people to the response capability that occurs when we understand the opportunity we have right now to
Mm-hmm.
change those legacies so that the next 300 years will be so much different than the last 300. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
think of your context, I'm very curious to know people and be in conversation with people who have long since been contemplating how do you meet the responsibility of the moment in light of missed opportunities at the very founding of the nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And I think it's an ongoing process for us. We started doing these land acknowledgements, and what I really encourage people to do was to move beyond saying, um, and because it's a geographically fairly small area, eventually the land acknowledgements are all the same land acknowledgements a little bit. And, so what I said to people, I said, when we have presbytery meetings at churches, look up your local history, go to your local library, see what that is, and offer us 5 minutes at the front of a meeting on what you learned, what you didn't know, and let that be the land acknowledgement. Let that be the beginning of the conversation. Because you need to sort of do a little bit of digging in order to get at that a little bit. And so it's been interesting to see how different folks have taken those land acknowledgements in our presbytery over the last few years, because some people have really gotten into it and done some interesting research, and found out some stuff about why'd this church get built here, or my family's lived in this area for a long time, or I learned this about this area. And um, that's I think been a healthy exercise for us. It's not the end to everything, right? But it's a beginning. And I'll be interested to see over the next year how some of that unfolds in the life of this presbytery. We have a conversation going with some descendants of Indigenous peoples in one part of our presbytery about a potential land return.
Yeah.
And we have Dr. Yu coming from Columbia Theological to meet with us in November, to do a whole day of history and learning about our area and talking through that. And so um, I think we have to continue to be about that and continue to sort of build those pieces into who we are and what we do so that we can keep moving forward um, in new
Absolutely.
ways, in different ways.
And I think it's important too not to be afraid to talk to Indigenous people and
Mhm.
simply ask, what is required of us to move forward
Mhm.
along with you into a future where these legacies have, to the greatest extent possible, been shifted in the direction
Right.
of righteousness. And I think people are afraid because they believe the response will be something beyond what is possible.
Mm.
But when you think about it, whether you're talking about, African Americans or the people who are indigenous to these lands, people may have some things to get off their chest. So I'm not going to tell you, if you ask that question, you're not going to get an earful of some things you
Yeah.
know what to do with and some things you may not know what to do with yet.
Hmm.
But we are invested for the most part in responding to our own ancestors' claims on our lives, which means our ancestors don't expect us to simply respond to questions like what can be done about the past in a way that gets things off our chest. But our response has to be one that is respectful of what has been invested in us and
Hmm.
also respectful of what we will hand off to the next generation in terms
Hmm.
of relationships, collaborations, and future possibilities. And so I think it's helpful for people to realize that it's a good thing to be brave and
Hmm.
to ask the question, what does what is required for right relations to be the state of affairs among us?
Hmm.
And then to listen to what is said and then tell people with whom you can work on those problems with in order to move forward into the future. Churches have had some success doing that and have been surprised that what's being required of them is actually within their reach. They can do it.
Hmm.
For example, Oak Grove Presbyterian Church in Bloomington is now in a process of rethinking how they narrate the story of their original founders, who had
Mm.
heavy involvement with Lakota and Dakota people in that region. And there's a story that that church has told itself about its relationship with those indigenous groups. And they've been asked to rethink the way that they tell that story so that the story more accurately reflects historical memory and
Mm.
place where they might go together into the future once a narrative is created that makes sense. And
Mm.
so I say little things like that, but it's not little, it's a big thing.
No, it's a big thing.
But it's finite enough that people can hear that, consider
Hmm.
what doing that might require, and then begin a process in earnest. And I think it's when we begin processes in earnest that we begin to signal that something is changing. We
Hmm.
no longer consider impossible those things we used to consider impossible. And that becomes a public witness that
Hmm.
helps other people notice that, oh, this reparative justice thing, it actually makes sense.
Hmm.
It builds up relationships rather than tear those relationships down. And I think that's the type of witness that will characterize how the Presbyterians and other denominations move forward into our
Hmm.
collective future.
Yeah. And it's an act of testimony of telling who Jesus is and how Jesus shows up in our life and how Jesus, who is also our ancestor, calls us. And it puts us in a different space. It's a way of giving testimony, I think, as well. And these are things that we don't usually say, and Presbyterian circles use words like this, but I think um, these are um, these are pieces. And we are also um doing work on our own souls and our own spirits, and those who will come after us. So I think it's holy work, right, to be about some of this for sure. It's been great chatting, Jermaine. I've been closing up these podcasts by asking people as we close. We've talked about so many things today, but and I hope this conversation has been a balm for those who've been listening to it, and also just sort of a real um, opportunity for reflection and an opportunity an impetus for moving forward, because I think there's a lot here for folks who are listening. I've been asking people to give us a sense of something that's kind of making you, sort of feel stuck in your work or outraged in your work, and something that's making you feel optimistic in the work that you're about. Where's the Holy Spirit showing up, and where is that, thing we most believe in as Presbyterians, total depravity, still kind of pulling you back a little bit. So where's that sitting for you as you think about some of the ministry that you've been called to, Jermaine?
My goodness. So
Small question.
first thing that comes to mind is this statement from James Baldwin, and I'm
Mm,
paraphrasing here, but Baldwin says to be African American and to be even halfway conscious, I think conscious is what he says,
mm,
is to be enraged almost all of the time.
mm,
And when I read that years ago for the first time, I recognized that, oh, that's true. And secondarily, that's not good for my health and probably not anyone else's either. And so I try to I try to stay away from being enraged. Although
mm,
sometimes people can confuse being enraged with being filled with prophetic fire. And
mm-hmm,
although there's some overlap, there are important differences. But something that really challenges me right now as I try to avoid being enraged for the longevity of my ministry, something that is challenging to me is our reluctance to refuse binaries when in fact
mm,
we have the power to create better choices than the ones that
right.
are merely handed to us. So by the time that people hear this podcast, an election will have already been passed
Yeah.
and a decision will have been made. And
Mm-hmm,
I think probably the wisest way to say this right now is that I hope that people will realize that now is always the time to
yes.
create choices that
Mm-hmm,
allow us to move in the direction of our rhetoric
right.
rather than pretend for an entire lifetime that it's okay to speak the ideals, but then go along with an evil status quo that
Mm-hmm,
produces death that is the opposite of the life the Holy Spirit is constantly breathing into us.
yes.
That our refusal to make new choices when we have the ability to do so is something that does tempt me
Mm-hmm,
to communicate in terms of rage.
mm-hmm,
And I also realize that that is probably rarely helpful.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And instead, the goal is to figure out how to speak these new possibilities in such a way that people are inspired to become preoccupied with implementing new
Mm-hmm,
possibilities rather than just keep them in the category of ideals we
yeah.
never expect to implement in real life.
Yeah.
But as I travel around the country and talk to our people about the ministry of repair, what really gives me life is that sense of, I see now, that comes across people
Mm-hmm,
as the Spirit does the work that the Spirit does to help people realize
mm-hmm,
all is not lost. There
mm-hmm,
are things that we can do to transform ourselves and our world.
mm-hmm,
And, I often tell a story about one of my colleagues in Restorative Actions, which is an economic justice initiative based in the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, where I'm, happy
mm-hmm,
to work as a volunteer and a co-leader in theological matters related to
mm,
reparations. But one of our colleagues there used to think reparation was a bad idea that didn't have any common sense associated with it, and that was thereby only a
mm,
divisive topic. And this was, of course, years ago, but the process by which I have watched that opinion be transformed into a reparations affirmative attitude matched with reparations affirmative activity, that has been one of the biggest evidences that I've experienced in my ministry of the power of the Holy Spirit to transform someone from a position that I thought was permanent to a position that I now realize is one that is viable for just about everyone on the planet.
yeah.
And that continues to give me a curiosity and an energy to discover, what else is it that God can transform us into
Mm-hmm,
doing when we
mm-hmm,
actually trust in the leadership and the power of the Holy Spirit?
yeah. Thank you, Jermaine. Yeah. We have to believe in God again, right? At the root of all of this. We've got to
Right.
believe that God is full of power, God is full of possibilities, and the Holy Spirit is still active and showing up in our world. And that the call of Jesus is still needed, right? Because I think so much sort of weighs us down and makes us think nothing new can happen. And there's a lot of testimony in the Bible about all of that. So
There certainly is. And I
there's a
think it's
lot.
for us to lean into what what
Mm-hmm.
French theologian and philosopher Paul Ricoeur referred to as the second naivety, which is
Right.
to say that we can become naive again,
Mm-hmm.
believing in the impossible becoming possible, and
Mm-hmm.
allowing the Holy Spirit to transform us into the people who will co-create the possible so that it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a lived experience for God's people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jermaine. It's been such an honor to have had you on our podcast and talk with you. I hope we'll get you out here someday to the Presbytery of Southern New England. And it's been, a great honor to know you and continue to know you. And I'm excited to see what next new things happen out of all of this work, what the Holy Spirit is doing with us. We're going to throw some resources in the resource link that goes with this podcast, information about the Center for Repair. We actually watched the video introduction that was done with you, Jermaine, when you started as our land acknowledgement at our last Presbytery meeting. We used that for the land acknowledgement time to sort of explain what the Center for Repair was to the Presbytery uh,
Beautiful.
at our
Thank
last
you.
Presbytery meeting. So, but we will put that back in the show notes for everybody. And just a word of gratitude, Jermaine, to you for your ministry, for all you're a part of. Good luck as you continue your thesis. This presbytery is full of people with PhDs because we've got a lot of seminaries in our bounds. And so
Yes.
this is the kind of presbytery that always cheers people on in doctoral work. So
Thank you.
so
I
we
need
wish
it.
you many blessings upon all of that. And thank you for helping us think of ways we can be ambassadors of Matthew 25 and disciples of Jesus in deeper ways.
Thank you, Shannon. It's been an
Thank
honor.
you. Thank you, Jermaine.